The brass key dragged at the wool of his trousers, a cold weight against the thigh as Bertram Shaw climbed the stairs. It was 6:30, and while the street below still slept under a bruise of coal smoke, the air up here moved differently, thin and sharp against the cheek. He took the steps 2 at a time, the tread of his boots knocking a rhythm into the wood that usually summoned a groan from the floorboards or a curse from a neighbor behind a thin wall, yet today nothing answered. Just the dust motes swirling in the grey light that leaked through the grimy window at the turn of the landing, dancing in the silence. Shaw came to a halt, his hand drifting to his pocket where his fingers closed around the key again, needing the reassurance of metal. He was a railwayman, accustomed to schedules and the predictable churn of wheels on track, to the whistle that marked the beginning and end of labor, but this house on St. Paul's Road operated on no such timetable. There was an order to it, certainly, a rhythm of comings and goings that he knew by heart, for Emily Dimmock liked her privacy, keeping her door latched until noon most days, yet she never barred him from the morning call, hot water, coal, the small transactions of a lodging house that kept the world turning. He reached the landing outside number 29, where the air sat still and heavier than the stairwell, carrying a scent that did not belong to the usual mix of damp plaster and stale tobacco. It smelled of iron, sharp and metallic, like a penny held under the tongue, causing Shaw to frown as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other while the leather of his boots creaked in the quiet. He knocked once, knuckles rapping against the painted wood, the sound dull and flat against the silence. "Miss Dimmock." The silence remained unbroken, heavy and expectant, so he waited, counting the seconds by the pulse in his wrist, while expecting the shuffle of sheets or the scrape of a chair. The quiet stretched out, not peaceful but taut, like a wire pulled too tight, before he knocked again, harder this time, the sound echoing down the stairwell towards the street below where a cart rumbled past with iron rims clattering on the cobbles. "Open up, love, it's Shaw." Still the room offered no reply, prompting him to insert the key into the lock where the brass felt cold against his thumb. He turned it, and the mechanism engaged with a grind of neglected metal, the tumblers falling into place with a click that sounded too loud in the confined space, yet when he pushed, the door did not swing inward. It held firm, resistant, as though rooted to the frame, so Shaw leaned his shoulder into the wood, applying the weight of his body while expecting the usual give of a latch or the friction of swollen timber. The wood refused to yield. "Damn thing." He stepped back, looking at the door as if it had changed shape in the night, noting how the paint was chipped near the handle to reveal the dark grain beneath, and how a strip of wallpaper peeled from the frame where the humidity had done its work. Nothing unusual presented itself, nothing that should stop a man from entering his own lodging house, so he tried the handle again, jiggling it while listening for the rattle of the latch. It moved freely, yet the door remained shut, suggesting something was pressing against the wood from the inside. Shaw wiped his palms on his coat, the fabric rough against his skin, and looked down the stairwell where the light was growing, the grey dawn strengthening into a pale yellow that illuminated the dust on the banister. He could hear the sound of a woman coughing in the room below, a wet, hacking noise that spoke of consumption and cold mornings, but up here the air remained stagnant. He placed his ear against the wood, pressing close until the smell of the paint filled his nose, sharp and chemical, yet he heard nothing. No breathing, no movement, just the stillness of a room that had been sealed against the world. He stepped back again, his breath coming shorter now, the rhythm of his chest unsettled, for this was not like her. Emily was a creature of habit, rising late but never locking out the morning entirely, and there was always a crack of light, a sign of life, a reason for the door to remain closed. He looked at the key in his hand, turning it over while checking the teeth for damage, knowing it was the master key, the one that opened every room on the floor, the one the landlord kept in the safe downstairs. It had turned, the lock had opened, but the door would not yield. "Miss Dimmock." His voice sounded thin, swallowed by the corridor, so Shaw placed his shoulder against the door once more, planting his feet on the worn runner, and pushed with all his strength. The wood groaned, the frame shuddering in the plaster, but the obstruction held firm, feeling solid and unyielding, like pushing against a wall of stone. He stopped, breathing hard, the sweat cooling on his forehead despite the chill in the air, knowing something was pressing against the door from the inside. He looked at the gap beneath the frame, the narrow strip of darkness where the floorboards of the room met the wood of the door, yet no light leaked through, no draught, nothing moved. He crouched down, squinting while trying to see into the shadow, but the angle was wrong, the darkness too complete. He straightened up, his knees cracking, and stared at the handle, telling himself it was just a door, wood and paint and iron, though it felt like a mouth closed tight against a secret. Shaw reached for the key again, his fingers trembling slightly, and turned it back, locking the door once more while the click sounded final, like a coffin lid shutting. He stood there for a moment, hand resting on the wood, feeling the cold seep into his palm, knowing he needed to find the landlord. He needed to fetch the police. He needed to do something other than stand here in the gloom, listening to the silence of a room that should have been full of life. He turned away from the door, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and began to walk back towards the stairs where the light was stronger now, illuminating the dust on the banister, the peeling wallpaper, the signs of a house that had seen too many tenants and too little care. He descended the first step, then stopped, looking back at number 29. The smell of stale beer hit Neil first, a sour tang that clung to the back of the throat and spoke of mornings spent nursing a glass rather than sweeping the stairs. It rolled out from the crack beneath the office door, mixing with the damp wool scent of a coat left too long on a hook, creating an atmosphere so thick it felt like walking through broth. Neil pushed the door open without knocking. Mr. Gardner sat behind a desk scarred by ink stains and the rings of wet mugs, his bulk spilling over a chair that groaned under the weight. He looked up, eyes darting to the inspector's badge before settling on the rain-slicked brim of Neil's hat, fingers twitching against the ledger open on the blotter. The room was small, cluttered with rent books stacked in precarious towers that leaned like drunken men, and a single gas jet that hissed softly despite the daylight pressing against the grimy window. Inspector, Gardner's voice was a gravelly scrape, unused to polite company, when he added that he had told the constable everything. Poor girl, it was a tragic business. You told him what you wished to tell him. Neil stepped forward, the floorboards creaking a protest under his boots, and placed a gloved hand on the edge of the desk. Now you will tell me the rest. Gardner shifted, the fabric of his trousers whispering against the wood, and reached for a handkerchief tucked in his sleeve. He wiped his brow, the cloth coming away grey with sweat and grime, leaving a smear of camphor scent that battled the beer for dominance in the air. His eyes avoided Neil's, focusing instead on a loose thread on his cuff, which he picked at with a yellowed nail. There isn't much more to say. Every Monday she paid her rent, placing a coin on the table with no fuss. Emily Dimmock paid in coin, Neil said, the name feeling heavy in the small room. But the name in your book is E. Dimmock, just the initial, and the entry before that, a smudge where something was written and then scrubbed away. Gardner flinched, a tiny movement of the shoulder that betrayed him faster than any shout. He leaned back, the chair legs scraping harsh against the floor, and spread his hands in a gesture of helpless innocence that did not reach his eyes. Women like her, Inspector, they don't want their names in print, not in a ledger that might be seen by the morality squads or the neighbors with nothing better to do than judge. They pay extra for the silence. It's the way of things in Agar Grove. The way of things is that a woman lies dead with her throat cut, and you are worried about the prying eyes of the neighborhood. Neil's voice dropped, low and dangerous, stripping the warmth from the room until only the cold reality remained. Show me the book for August. Gardner hesitated, his mouth opening then closing, before he reached out and slid a heavy, leather-bound volume across the desk. The cover was cracked, the spine holding together with strips of tape that had yellowed with age. Neil pulled it closer, the smell of old paper and dust rising to meet him, and ran a gloved finger down the edge of the pages. The texture changed. Where the other leaves were smooth, worn soft by the turning of hands, this section felt rough, jagged. Neil stopped, his finger tracing the binding until he found it, the uneven stump where a page had been torn out, the fibers still sharp and white against the darker edge of the remaining paper. He did not look up immediately, letting the silence stretch, letting Gardner feel the weight of the omission pressing down on his chest. A page seems to have met with an accident, Mr. Gardner. Old books fall apart, you know how it is. The landlord's voice rose a notch, brittle and defensive, Rats, damp, clumsy fingers, it happens. It happens when someone needs to hide a transaction. Neil lifted the book, holding it so the light from the window caught the torn edge, illuminating the violence done to the paper. Did you tear it out before the police arrived, or did you wait until we were busy with the body? Gardner stood up abruptly, the chair toppling backward with a crash that echoed in the small space. He grabbed the edge of the desk, knuckles white, leaning forward as if to challenge the inspector, but the fear in his eyes held him back. I run a respectable house. I don't need trouble from the yard breathing down my neck over every tenant who comes and goes. If she wanted to use a nickname, that was her business. If she wanted to pay cash and keep her history off the page, I wasn't going to argue. Her history is now my business. Neil placed the ledger back on the desk with deliberate slowness, the thud sounding final. Who else stayed in the room before her in the week prior? No one. It was empty. Empty rooms do not accumulate secrets, Mr. Gardner. They accumulate dust. Neil leaned in, close enough to see the broken capillaries on the landlord's nose, close enough to smell the fear souring the camphor on his skin. Try again. Gardner slumped, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had risen. He sank back into his chair, writing it with a trembling hand, and stared at the torn edge of the ledger as if it might bite him. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper that had been folded and refolded until the creases were soft. There was a letter found in the bin downstairs where I thought it was rubbish. He slid the paper across the desk, avoiding Neil's gaze. She dropped it, or maybe she meant to post it and forgot. I don't know. Neil picked up the paper, smoothing it out against the wood. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, the ink blotted in places where the writer had paused too long. An address was scrawled at the top, a street just off the main road, and a name, Ruby Young. Ruby Young, Neil read aloud, the name tasting of iron and possibility. A friend. The only one who visited regular, like they'd sit on the steps smoking and talking low, never causing trouble. Gardner wiped his brow again, the handkerchief now black with grime. That's all I know, I swear it. Neil folded the letter and tucked it into his coat pocket, the paper crackling softly against his ribs. He looked around the office one last time, taking in the stacks of rent books, the smell of stale beer, the man sweating in his chair who valued silence over justice. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air thick with the unspoken truths of Camden. Lock the door when I leave, Neil said, turning towards the exit. And do not leave the premises. I will have questions about that missing page later. He stepped out into the hallway, the smell of beer fading behind him, replaced by the damp chill of the stairwell. The house was quiet, the tenants holding their breath behind their doors, listening to the heavy tread of the inspector's boots as he descended towards the street. Outside, the sky had opened, a fine rain beginning to fall that turned the cobblestones to black mirrors, reflecting the grey despair of the afternoon. Neil pulled his collar up against the drizzle, the letter burning a hole in his pocket, and walked towards the address scrawled in the dead woman's hand. The city swallowed him, a vast machine of brick and soot that churned on regardless of the blood spilled in room 29, but for the first time since finding the body, he had a direction. A name, a street, a thread to pull before the whole tangled mess unraveled into nothing. He turned the corner, the rain stinging his face, and quickened his pace. Wood drew the door shut, excluding the grey afternoon and the inspector's damp wool smell, though the scent of the street clung to Neil like a second skin. The latch clicked, a small final sound in the high-ceilinged room. Dust motes danced in the light from the north-facing window, undisturbed by the intrusion. Wood moved past the man without touching him, gliding towards the table where a silver case lay open beside a jar of turpentine. Take a cigarette, Inspector, you look frozen. He did not wait for permission. Wood tapped the case, sending one cylinder up from the pack, and offered it across the clutter of brushes and rags. Neil hesitated, gloved hand hovering, before accepting the tobacco with a grunt that might have been gratitude. Wood struck a match against the leg of his trousers. The sulphur flare bloomed bright, casting deep shadows into the corners of the studio where canvases faced the wall. Thank you, Neil's voice was flat. He did not smoke immediately. The weather, Wood said, lighting his own and drawing the smoke deep into his lungs as if trying to capture the very air itself. It refuses to make up its mind. 1 hour sun, the next a deluge, rendering London in September nothing more than a gamble. It's wet. Neil exhaled a stream of blue haze that mingled with the smell of oil paint. And it's getting darker earlier. You notice that? I notice the light. That is my profession. Wood leaned back against the work table, crossing his ankles. He kept his hands visible. There was a strategy to posture, a way to occupy space that suggested nothing to hide. You are not here to discuss the meteorology of Camden, however. You would not have climbed the stairs if the weather was your only concern. Neil took a step forward, his boots leaving faint prints on the floorboards. He did not look at Wood's face. The inspector's gaze swept the room, cataloguing the chaos of creation, the splattered apron hanging near the fire, the easel draped in a sheet, the piles of sketches teetering on a chair. The eyes stopped on the apron. It hung from a hook by the hearth, the fabric stiff with dried medium. A broad stain spread across the chest, dark and crusty. Wood followed the line of sight. He kept his expression neutral, a mask of polite curiosity. That, Wood said, nodding towards the fire, is where I keep the worst of the mess. Vermilion dries slowly, and it tends to drip. Neil moved closer to the hearth. He did not touch the fabric. He simply stood before it, the heat from the dying coal washing over his coat. Vermilion is a bright red, Mr. Wood. That looks brown. Oxidation. The word came quickly, too quickly. Wood slowed his breathing, forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. Paint is chemical. It changes as it ages. Leave it on linen for a day and it shifts. You know how blood changes color when it dries? It is similar. Art is chemistry, Inspector, not magic. Is it? Neil turned back to him. The cigarette burned untouched between his fingers. And where were you when the chemistry was taking place on St. Paul's Road? Wood took a drag, letting the smoke fill the space between them. He needed time to arrange the words. The truth was a slippery thing. Better to offer a version that felt like truth without binding him to the gallows. He gestured with the cigarette, a casual arc of ash falling to the floor. I told your constable I was walking, for the canal is peaceful at night when the water reflects the gaslight. He paused, watching Neil's face for a flicker of belief. I find I work better after a walk because it clears the mind and removes the clutter. Alone. Entirely. No one saw you. The fog was thick. One rarely sees anyone in the fog. Wood pushed off the table, walking towards the window. He looked out at the rain streaking the glass, blurring the world beyond into impressionistic smears. You suspect me because I knew her, because I painted her. There is a logic to it, I suppose. In the eyes of the public, an artist who paints a nude is already halfway to a criminal. I suspect you because a woman is dead. Neil crushed the cigarette out on the rim of an ashtray, grinding the ember until it died. And because you were the last person seen with her, before the door was locked. Wood turned from the window. The light caught the sharp line of his jaw, the carefully combed hair. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, but he kept his hands steady. He picked up a rag and began to wipe a spot of paint from his thumb, the motion rhythmic, soothing. Locked, Wood repeated. That is the mystery, is it not? How a door locks itself. Perhaps she did it. Perhaps she wanted to keep the world out. Or keep someone in. Neil's gaze dropped to Wood's hands. The rag was white, but the stain on his thumb was reddish-brown. You use a lot of vermilion, Mr. Wood. I use what the subject demands. Wood dropped the rag onto the pile. It landed softly. Emily liked color. She said the gray of Camden was enough to drown a person. She wanted to be remembered in red. If you don't give me something solid, she won't be remembered at all. Neil stepped away from the fire, moving towards the door, where he stopped with his hand on the latch to look back over his shoulder. Shadows carved deep lines into his face, making him look older and weary. That smock. I'll be sending a man for it. He issued his final commands with sharp clarity. Do not wash it, and do not move it. It's just paint. Then it won't matter. Neil opened the door. The sound of the rain returned, louder now, rushing into the quiet room. If it's just paint. Wood stood still as the inspector left, the door closing again with a heavy thud. He waited until the footsteps faded down the stairs, Only then did he move, walking slowly to the hearth. He reached out and touched the smock. The fabric was stiff, cold. The stain was dark, almost black in the dim light. He rubbed his thumb against the material, feeling the rough texture of the dried fluid. It flaked under his nail. He walked to the wastebasket beside the desk. Inside lay a crumpled envelope, torn open. The postmark was visible, dated 2 days prior. He pushed it deeper into the paper scraps, burying it under a layer of charcoal shavings. Wood returned to the easel and lifted the sheet covering the canvas. The portrait stared back at him, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. He picked up his brush, dipping it into the pot of vermilion. The color was bright, alive. He touched the brush to the canvas, adding a stroke to the cheek. It looked like blood. It looked like life. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers. The rain beat against the window, a steady rhythm against the silence of the room. There was no one to hear him breathe, no one to see the tremor in his hand as he set the brush down. The cardstock felt rough under Ruby's thumb, cheap pulp that absorbed the ink until the letters looked like bruises. She sat at her kitchen table, the wood scarred by knives and hot irons, while Inspector Neal stood in the corner where the shadows pooled thickest. Above them, the gas mantle hissed, a blue cone of light that made the grease on the wallpaper shimmer. 5 postcards lay spread before her like a hand of playing cards dealt by a cheat. None of them bore a return address. None of them needed to. "Take your time, Miss Young." Neal's voice came from the dark, flat, and devoid of impatience. "But do not take too long." Ruby lifted the card dated September 10th. The ink was black, sharp against the cream background, and she could smell the faint, cloying scent of violet powder that Emily always dusted on her neck. It had transferred to the paper when she held it, a ghost of her friend clinging to the evidence. Ruby traced the loop of the first letter. Her finger shook, just once, a tiny tremor that traveled up her wrist and settled in her shoulder. "He wrote to her often?" Neal asked. "Sometimes." Ruby kept her eyes on the table. Looking at the inspector made the words stick in her throat. "When he wanted something." "And she read them to you." She liked the words. Ruby pushed the card slightly to the left, aligning it with the edge of the table. Straight lines mattered when the world was tilting. Emily said he had a way with language, said it sounded like poetry even when he was asking for money. "Poetry." Neal stepped forward into the light. His boots squeaked on the linoleum. He leaned over the table, his hands clasped behind his back, examining the arrangement of cards without touching them. "Did she keep all of them?" "In a box, under the bed," Ruby said as she swallowed, the taste of stale tea lingering on her tongue. "I found them after the landlady told me to clear the room." "And you brought them to me?" "You asked for anything that looked like correspondence." Ruby looked up then, meeting his gaze. His eyes were tired, rimmed with red, as if he hadn't slept since the body was found. "I gave you what I had. I didn't keep anything back." Neal didn't blink. He studied her face, searching for the lie that wasn't there. The clock on the mantel ticked, loud in the small room, marking seconds that felt like hours. Outside, a cart rumbled over the cobblestones, the wheels iron-shod and heavy, shaking the plates in the cupboard. Ruby waited for him to speak, her hands resting flat on the table to stop them shaking again. "The 10th, Neal said softly, 2 days before." "Yes. Read it." Ruby's breath hitched. She knew the words by heart. Emily had read them aloud while brushing her hair, standing before the cracked mirror in the lodging house, smiling at her own reflection as if the words were a compliment rather than a command. Ruby could see her now, the ribbon caught in the bristles, the way she turned her head to catch the light. "It says," Ruby stopped, her throat tightened, "it says he will be waiting." "Waiting where?" "At the usual place." Ruby traced the line again. The ink had bitten deep into the fibers, a permanent mark on temporary paper. He signed it Will West. Neal straightened up. He walked to the window and looked out at the street, though the glass was too dark to see anything but their own reflection. Will West, a name we have seen before. "Emily said it was a joke." "Did she?" Neal turned back. "And did she laugh when she told you this joke?" "She laughed at everything." Ruby's voice hardened. "You didn't know her. You see the blood and the sheets and you think you know the woman. But Emily," she stopped. There was no point. The dead were dead, and the police only cared about how they stopped breathing. She thought it was clever, using a name that wasn't his. Wood, Neil said the name without inflection. You know the man who used this name. I know a man who visited her. Ruby pulled her hand back from the cards. The violet scent seemed stronger now, rising from the paper as the warmth of her touch woke it. He came to the house, sat in the parlor, painted her portrait. Did you see him write? Ruby hesitated. This was the edge of the cliff. Once she stepped over, there was no climbing back. The street outside would feel different tomorrow. The neighbors would look at her differently if word got out that she had put a rope around a man's neck. She looked at the card. The loop on the W dipped low, a hook dragging beneath the line. Once, she said, he had a notebook. And the writing. It looked, Ruby searched for the word, dismissing same as too final before settling on familiar. Neil moved closer. He placed a hand on the table, near the cards but not on them. His fingers were long, stained with ink from his own reports, familiar enough to swear to in a court. I haven't said I would swear to anything. Ruby shifted in her chair. The wood creaked. I'm telling you what I saw, what I remember. Memory is a fragile thing, Miss Young, Neil said, watching it fade and change shape before his gaze dropped to her hand, which still hovered over the September 10th card. But ink remains, paper remains. He reached out and tapped the corner of the card. The sound was dry, like a bone striking wood. Look at the flourish, Neil said, drawing attention to the signature and the specific way the pen lifts. Ruby looked. She had looked 100 times since she found the box. She had tried to convince herself it was different, that her eyes were playing tricks because of the grief and the horror. But the line was distinct, a sharp angle where a curve should be, a hesitation in the stroke that suggested the writer was careful, deliberate. He pressed hard, she whispered. Pressure indicates intent. Neil leaned in, his shadow falling over the cards, swallowing the light. It indicates he wanted the words to be read. He wanted them to remain. Ruby pulled her hand away completely, folding it into her lap. The cold seeped through her skirt from the chair. She thought of the lodging house, the way the hallway smelled of cabbage and coal dust, the way Emily's door had been locked from the inside. A locked room, a dead woman, a name that wasn't real. If I tell you, Ruby said, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the gas, if I say it is him, then we proceed. And if I am wrong? Neil didn't answer immediately. He looked at the cards, then at her, then back at the cards. The silence stretched, thin and tight, until it felt like it might snap. Then an innocent man walks, he said, and the killer remains in the shadows. Ruby looked down at the card. The violet scent was overwhelming, now sickly sweet. She placed her index finger on the signature. The paper was cool, the ink was dry. The loop of the W dipped below the line, a hook waiting to catch something. She pressed down, feeling the texture of the stock, the slight ridge where the pen had dug in. It curves here, she said. Neil went still. On the downstroke, Ruby continued, her finger tracing the shape again, slower this time. He drags it out, pulling the pen as if through treacle. Show me. Ruby picked up the card. She held it up to the light, tilting it so the shadows caught the indentation of the letters. The gaslight flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness before flaring bright again. In that flash, the handwriting seemed to move, the letters shifting on the page. She lowered the card and placed it squarely in front of the inspector. It matches, she said. Neil reached for the card. His hand hovered over it for a second, then closed around the edge. He lifted it, holding it up to his own eyes, examining the flourish she had pointed out. The room waited. The clock ticked. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping against the window pane like fingers testing the glass. Keep your hand on the table, Miss Young, Neil said, without looking up. I need you to write something for me. Ruby froze. What? A sample for comparison. Neil finally looked at her. His expression was unreadable, a mask of professional necessity. If we are to hang a man on this, we need more than memory, we need proof. I can't write like him. No, Neil placed a fresh sheet of paper on the table. He slid a pen towards her. The nib glinted in the gaslight. "Write your own name, then write the name on the card." Ruby looked at the pen. It was black, heavy, the inkwell beside it full and dark. She thought of Emily's hand holding a pen just like it, scratching out replies to these very words. She thought of the locked door, the blood on the floor, the silence of the grave. She picked up the pen. The metal was cold against her skin. She dipped the nib into the ink, watching the liquid cling to the steel. "What do I write?" she asked. "Will West," Neil said. "Write it exactly as you see it." Ruby hesitated, the nib hovering above the paper until a single drop of ink fell from the tip, landing on the white surface with a soft splat that spread, dark and final. She lowered the pen. As the tip touched the paper, she began to form the letter. The nib scratched. It caught on the fiber of the page, resisting the pull of her wrist, until she forced it down into the dip that defined the man. Ruby pressed harder than she intended, the steel tines spreading wide enough to hold a drop of ink like a dark eye staring back at her. She dragged the stroke downward, extending the tail past the line, letting it hook beneath the baseline just as she had seen him do in the parlor at number 29. Her hand trembled, not from cold, though the draft from the window sash had numbed her fingers to the bone, but from the act of impersonation. To write a man's name was to summon him. It was to call him into the room, out of the shadows of Camden, and place him squarely under the glare of the gas jet. "Again," Neil said. He did not raise his voice. The instruction landed flat on the table, heavier than the inkwell. Ruby lifted the pen. The nib was wet, glossy. She wiped it on the rim of the bottle, a nervous tick she had learned from watching Emily tidy her vanity table. A smudge of black stained her thumb. She looked at it, then at the inspector. He was watching the paper, not her face. His attention was fixed on the wet ink, waiting for it to set, waiting for the truth to harden into evidence. "He sat there," Ruby said. Her voice sounded thin, stretched tight across the space between them. "At this same table, Emily made him tea." "Did he use this pen?" "No, he had his own, a propelling pencil, gold-capped." Ruby paused as the memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and clear despite the fog of grief that had clouded her weeks since the murder. He liked the click of it when he thought, or when he lied. She moved the pen to the fresh line. She wrote "Will." The letters slanted forward, aggressive, leaning into the wind. She did not try to match the card perfectly. That would be forgery, and she would not hang herself for a stranger. She only needed to capture the habit, the muscle memory of the hand that held the weapon, or the pen, or both. "Look at the cross," she said before Neil could speak. "On the T, he doesn't lift the pencil, he slashes through one motion." Neil leaned closer. The smell of him was tobacco and damp wool, the scent of a man who walked the streets until his boots leaked. He did not flinch at the proximity of the paper. He studied the stroke where the crossbar intersected the vertical line, a violent junction that spoke of impatience. "And the West?" "Same," Ruby wrote the rest. The W dipped low, a hook dragging beneath the line. "He always went below, said it anchored the word, kept it from floating away." "A poet." "An artist." Ruby put the pen down. The metal clattered against the saucer beneath the inkwell. "He painted her, in the nude, said it was study." The room contracted. The walls seemed to push in, closing off the escape routes. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming a irregular rhythm against the glass that matched the pounding in Ruby's chest. She wiped her thumb on her apron, leaving a smear of soot over the blue fabric. It would not wash out. Some stains took hold deeper than the fiber. Neil picked up the sample. He held it by the edges, careful not to smudge the wet ink with his own skin. He placed it beside the postcard dated September 10th. The two pieces of paper lay side by side, white and cream, one fresh and one traveled through the post. The handwriting sat on them like a fingerprint, unique and damning. "The loop," Neil said. He tapped the sample with a fingernail. "You matched the depth. I told you, it's a hook." "It is distinct." Neil lifted the postcard. He turned it over, examining the back where the address was written. The ink here was older, faded to a dull gray where the fresh sample shone black. "Most men write flat. They stay on the line. This writer digs." He wanted to be known. Ruby pulled her hands into her sleeves. The cold was seeping up from the floorboards now, rising through the soles of her boots. Even if he used a false name, he wanted her to know it was him. Or he wanted us to know. Neil's eyes shifted from the paper to her face. If he intended to confuse the investigation, he chose a peculiar method. To sign an alias with such a distinctive flourish is to invite comparison. Men are vain. Ruby looked away. She could not meet his gaze. It felt too much like an accusation, as if she were the one on trial for knowing too much, even when they are careful, especially then. Neil said nothing. He reached for the magnifying glass lying near the edge of the table. The lens was thick, the brass rim tarnished by handling. He positioned it over the postmark on the card. The glass distorted the stamp, making the profile of the king swell and bulge beneath the curvature. "The date," Neil murmured. "September 10th. "And the collection time." Neil adjusted the focus. The wheel on the side of the lamp clicked as he turned the wick down, dimming the light to sharpen the contrast on the paper. "Stamped at 6 in the evening." Ruby frowned. Emily was alive at 6. The card was posted at 6. Neil looked up. The shadow of the lamp bracket cut across his cheekbone, dividing his face into light and dark. It would not arrive until the following morning, by which time she was dead. Ruby finished the sentence for him. The words tasted like ash. He sent it before he killed her. Or he sent it knowing she would be dead when it arrived. Neil set the glass down. The click was final. A message for the corpse, or a message for the finder. Why? To confuse the timeline. As Neil traced the edge of the card again, he noted that a pre-mortem postmark suggests the writer was not at the scene. It provides an alibi of distance. While the act is committed, he is elsewhere, posting a letter. But the handwriting. Handwriting can be practiced. Dates can be manipulated if one knows the collection hours of the local box. Neil stood up. The chair legs scraped against the floor, a harsh shriek that made Ruby flinch. He walked to the window, looking out into the dark street where the rain blurred the gas lamps into halos of sickly yellow. But the habit remains, the hook beneath the line. "You think he planned it?" "I think he is clever." Neil turned back from the window. The light caught the buttons of his coat. Clever men make mistakes. They believe their own intelligence protects them. They leave signatures because they cannot resist the urge to claim ownership. Ruby looked at the sample she had written. The ink was drying, losing its sheen, becoming matte and permanent. It looked like a confession written in her own hand. She felt a sudden urge to crumple the paper, to toss it into the fire burning low in the grate, to destroy the link before it could be forged into a chain. "If I testify," she said, the words came out slowly, weighed down by the consequence. "He will know it was me. He will know someone identified the script. He knows I saw him write." Ruby stood up, her knees cracking as the stiffness of sitting too long in the cold seized her joints. "He knows I was in the room. If he walks free, Inspector, he will come here." Neil moved away from the window, crossing the room in 3 strides before stopping just short of the table. He did not touch her, nor did he offer comfort, offering only the stark reality of the law. "If he walks free, it is because the Crown failed to prove the link." Neil's voice was low, devoid of sympathy but full of certainty. "But if you withhold this, if you hide the recognition, then you are complicit in the silence that protects him. Which burden do you prefer, Miss Young, the fear of a man or the weight of a friend's unavenged death?" Ruby looked at the card. The violet scent had faded, replaced by the sharp tang of the ink. She thought of Emily's laugh, the way she tossed her head when she was drunk on gin, the way she had trusted the wrong man with the key to her room. Trust was a currency spent too easily in Agar Grove. "The hook," Ruby said. She touched the paper again. "It dips below like a fish hook." "I have noted it." Neil picked up the sample sheet. He folded it once, twice, until it was a small square of white hidden in his palm. "I will have an expert examine the strokes. Graphology is not yet perfect science, but it carries weight with a jury." "Juries listen to experts." "They listen to certainty." Neil put the folded paper into his pocket. He patted the fabric, ensuring it was secure. "You have given me the certainty. Now I must build the rest. He reached for his hat. The brim was wet from the rain outside. He placed it on his head, tipping it slightly forward. Stay indoors, Miss Young, until I send for you. And if he comes... Neil paused at the door. His hand rested on the latch. The wood was scarred from years of use, deep grooves worn into the surface by fingernails and keys. Lock the door, Neil said, and do not open it for anyone but me. He opened the door. The noise of the street rushed in, the sound of wheels on wet cobbles, and the distant shout of a newsboy selling the evening edition. The fog rolled into the hallway, grey and thick, swallowing the light from the lamp. Neil stepped out into the corridor, pulling the door shut behind him. Ruby stood alone in the kitchen. The gas hissed. The paper on the table was blank where the sample had been, but the indentation remained, a ghost of the pressure she had applied. She ran her finger over the spot. The ridge was faint, but it was there. She walked to the window. Below, a figure moved through the rain, a tall man in a dark coat, walking briskly towards the corner. He did not look up. He disappeared into the mist before she could see his face. Ruby turned away from the glass. She picked up the postcard. The date stared back at her. September 10th, 6 o'clock, the time the letter was posted, the time the trap was set. She turned the card over. There in the corner of the message space was a small smudge, not ink, something reddish-brown, dried into the fiber of the paper. She had never noticed it before. She brought it closer to the lamp. It looked like rust or blood. Turpentine coated the tongue, a sharp chemical sting that scratched the back of the throat and promised headaches by evening. Neil stepped over a pile of discarded sketches, charcoal smudges mapping the floorboards like dark islands in a grey sea. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light cutting through the high window, illuminating the clutter of a life lived in 2 dimensions. Canvases leaned against the walls, faces unfinished, eyes staring blankly at the intruders. Wood stood at the easel. He did not turn when the door opened, keeping his focus on the brush moving against the linen, a slow sweep of vermilion. The bristles dragged, leaving a thick trail of oil and pigment that smelled of earth and rust. Neil waited. The constables behind him shifted, leather creaking, boots scuffing the wood. Wood finished the stroke. He set the brush down in a jar of murky water. "Inspector, Mr. Wood." Neil produced the warrant. The paper crackled, stiff from the cold air outside. He held it out, not offering it, just displaying the seal and the signature that authorized the violation of this space. Wood wiped his hands on a rag already stiff with dried color. He took the paper, scanned it, and handed it back without a flicker of surprise. "You require the smock. I require anything stained with blood." Blood, the word sat heavy on Wood's tongue before he finally turned, leaning back against the workbench with arms crossed over a chest, shielded by a clean apron. "You assume too much, Inspector." Here they worked with reds, ochre, vermilion, lake. To the untrained eye, once dried, they all looked the same. Neil moved past him. The smock hung on the back of a chair, draped carelessly as if discarded in haste. Brownish patches marred the white linen, clustered near the pocket and the left cuff. He did not touch it immediately. He looked at Wood. "These are not fresh." "Art is a messy business." Wood pushed off the bench. He walked to the window, looking out at the street below where the fog was beginning to gather. "We do not worry about cleanliness when the light is good. When the model holds a pose, you do not stop to change your clothes." "Constable." Neil nodded as the officer stepped forward, pulling a large brown paper bag from his satchel before unfolding it with a snap of crisp paper. Neil lifted the smock from the chair, finding it heavier than expected and stiff with accumulated grime and dried fluid. He folded it once, then twice, careful not to rub the stained areas together. The smell hit him then. It was not just paint, but something sweeter and metallic. Wood watched from the window. His reflection in the glass was pale, a ghost superimposed over the grey sky. "You think this proves anything?" "I think it places you at the scene." "I was there often." Wood turned from the window. He smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes, remaining tight around the mouth. "Emily enjoyed my company. She enjoyed the sittings. That is not a crime, is it, to paint a friend?" Not when she is dead. Accidents happen. As Wood walked back to the easel, he picked up the brush again, dipping it into the red pot. She was lively, energetic, yet sometimes things get out of hand. A push, a fall, it does not mean murder. Neil sealed the bag, twine bit into the paper as he tied the knot. He cut the string with a knife from his pocket, the snip loud in the quiet room. We will know what this is. You will know what the chemist tells you. Wood applied the paint to the canvas, a new stroke overlapping the old, and he will tell you what you pay him to find. Science is a tool, Inspector, like a brush. It can paint a picture of guilt or innocence depending on the hand that holds it. Neil stood up. The bag was heavy in his hand. He felt the weight of it, the potential evidence contained within the brown paper. It felt like a stone or a coffin. Come, Sergeant. They moved to the door. Wood did not look up. He continued to paint, the brush moving in a rhythmic scratch against the weave. Neil paused at the threshold. The hallway was dark, the gas lamp flickering with a low hiss. Lock the door behind us, Mr. Wood. It is already locked. Neil stepped out into the corridor. The door clicked shut. The lock engaged with a solid thud. He stood there for a moment, listening, no footsteps approaching, no sound of movement, just the silence of the building, heavy and watchful. The constable waited, holding his satchel. Take it to the laboratory, Neil said. Give it to Dr. Pepperell. Tell him I want the result by morning. He will say it is inconclusive. He will say what the test shows. As Neil started down the stairs, the banister felt cold under his hand, its wood worn smooth by decades of tenants. If it is blood, we have him. If it is paint, we have nothing. And if it is both? Neil stopped on the landing. The light from the window below was fading, the afternoon dying into early dusk. Shadows stretched across the stairs, long and thin like fingers reaching up. Then we have a man who paints with blood. He continued down. The street door opened onto the pavement, wet from the earlier rain. A hansom cab clattered past, wheels spraying mud onto the curb. Neil stepped aside, pressing himself against the brickwork. The driver did not look at him. No one looked at anyone in Camden unless they owed money or carried a warrant. The bag swung at his side. He could feel the stiffness of the linen through the paper. He thought of Ruby Young's handwriting sample, the way the ink had dried matte and permanent. He thought of Wood's smile, tight and unreadable. Science was a tool. Wood was right about that, but tools could break. They could fail. They could leave gaps wide enough for a barrister to drive a carriage through. Neil needed certainty. He needed the chemistry to speak where the witnesses faltered. He walked towards the corner. The fog was thickening, swallowing the gas lamps one by one. The city was closing in, shutting its eyes against the dark. In the laboratory, the chemicals would wait. The microscopes would be cleaned, the slides prepared. Neil turned onto the main road. The noise of the traffic increased, a roar of wheels and horses that drowned out the sound of his own footsteps. He tightened his grip on the bag. The paper crinkled. If the test failed, the case died. If the test succeeded, the real battle began. Wood would not hang without a fight. He had the words. He had the charm. He had the benefit of a doubt that grew larger with every hour the body lay cold in the mortuary. Neil hailed a cab. The driver pulled over, horse snorting steam into the cold air. Scotland Yard. Shilling. Neil climbed in. The leather seat was cracked, stuffing protruding like grey wool as he sat back and placed the bag on his lap. He held it there, protecting it from the jolts of the wheels. The cab moved off, and as the studio disappeared into the fog behind them, Wood was still painting. Neil knew it, seeing the artist in his mind, standing before the canvas to add another layer of red to the face of a woman who would never speak again. The horse trotted, the wheels clattered. The bag rested on Neil's knees, heavy with the weight of a life taken and a truth hidden in the fibers of a stained garment. The laboratory awaited. The chemicals waited. The truth waited. None of them were guaranteed. The laboratory air tasted of vinegar and wet stone, a sharp tang that coated the back of the throat and refused to wash away with a swallow of tea. Dr. Pepperell stood over the bench. his sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms dusted with the fine white powder of crushed chalk. He did not look up when Neil entered, his attention fixed on the glass slide where a single fiber from the smock lay trapped beneath the cover slip. The gas jet above him hissed, a steady, serpentine sound that filled the silence between the two men, marking time in a rhythm that felt too slow for the urgency burning in Neil's chest. "Wait," Pepperell said. His voice was flat, devoid of the deference usually offered to a man of the yard. "The reagent is reacting, or it is not. One must allow the chemistry its due patience." Neil set the paper bag on the edge of the table. The brown crinkled, a harsh noise against the soft drip of water from a tap somewhere in the shadows. He watched the chemist's hands. They were steady, precise, moving with the confidence of a man who believed in the absolute truth of numbers and reactions. Neil envied that certainty. In the streets, truth was a commodity traded for a pint of gin or a promise of silence. Here, under the glare of the mantle, it should be immutable. Pepperell lifted the dropper. A single bead of liquid, clear as water but heavy with unseen power, hovered at the tip before falling. It struck the fiber. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath, the dust motes dancing in the light suspended in midair. Then a bloom of color, faint pink, not the violent crimson of fresh arterial spray, but a shy, hesitant flush that spread slowly through the weave of the linen. "Hemoglobin," Pepperell murmured. He leaned closer, adjusting the focus wheel on the microscope with a twist of his thumb. "Likely human. The reaction is consistent." "Likely," Neil repeated. The word sat heavy on his tongue, bitter as the vinegar scent. "I need definitive, doctor, not likely. The defense will tear likely to shreds. They will bring in their own experts who will say it is rabbit blood, or ox, or the juice of a crushed berry." Pepperell straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that was already stained with a dozen unidentifiable colors. He turned to face Neil, his expression weary, the skin under his eyes gray and sagging. "Science in 1907 is not a miracle, Inspector. It is a suggestion. I can tell you it is blood. I can tell you it shares characteristics with human blood. But I cannot stand before a jury at the Old Bailey and swear on the Bible that this specific stain came from the throat of Emily Dimmock, and not from a butcher's apron or a shaving cut on the accused's own chin." He gestured to the slide. The pink hue had deepened slightly, mocking in its ambiguity. "The microscope reveals structure, not history. It shows us what the thing is, not how it got there. A barrister like Abinger, he will make this color look like mud. He will make your certainty look like arrogance." Neil looked down at the smock, now spread out on the separate tray. The large, dark patches were obvious, ugly bruises on the white fabric, but it was the smaller details that haunted him, the invisible threats hidden in the folds. He reached out, his fingers hovering over a white shirt that had been tucked beneath the smock, protected from the worst of the grime. The fabric was stiff, starched to a rigid crispness that spoke of a man concerned with appearances even in his squalor. "Turn it," Neil said. Pepperell complied, using a pair of tweezers to lift the sleeve of the shirt. The gaslight caught the cuff, illuminating the intricate stitching where the buttonhole had been reinforced. There, nestled in the weave of the linen, almost invisible against the white thread, was a speck. It was no larger than a pinhead, a tiny rust-colored dot that might have been dismissed as a fleck of dirt or a stray splash of vermilion paint. Neil leaned in, his nose inches from the fabric. He could smell the stale sweat of the wearer mixed with the metallic tang of the stain. It was distinct, isolated, a single point of failure in Wood's carefully constructed image of the careless artist. "This," Neil said, his voice dropped, becoming a low growl. "Bag this separately, do not let it touch the smock, do not let it touch anything." "It is minute," Pepperell noted, while peering at the spot with a magnifying loupe, adding that it was hardly enough for a full test, since the reagent might consume it entirely. "Then we test it last," Neil snapped. He straightened, his spine cracking with the movement. "If the smock proves inconclusive, this speck is all we have. It is on the cuff, doctor, where a hand would brush against a wound while leaning over a body. Paint does not settle in a single dot on a cuff unless the brush is dabbed there with intent. Blood flies, blood spatters, blood finds the smallest crevice." He watched as Pepperell carefully cut the section of the cuff away with a pair of sharp scissors. The snip was loud, final. The chemist placed the scrap of linen into a fresh envelope, sealing it with wax that dripped hot and red, mimicking the very substance they hunted. The action felt ritualistic, a desperate attempt to bind the evidence against the inevitable erosion of doubt. "You are building a house on sand, Neil," Pepperell said softly, pressing the seal with his signet ring. "Wood is clever. He knows the limits of our science as well as we do. He will argue that the smock is for his work, which is true. He will argue the shirt cuff caught a stray drop from a nosebleed or a nicked finger, which is possible. And without a motive that makes sense to 12 good men and true, possibility is enough to walk free." "Motive is for the jury to infer," Neil said, though the conviction drained from his words as he spoke. He took the sealed envelope. The wax was still warm, soft under his thumb. "We provide the facts. They provide the narrative." "Facts are slippery things," Pepperell muttered, turning back to his bench to clean the slide. "Especially when they are pink instead of red." Neil tucked the envelope into his inner pocket, close to his heart. The weight of it was negligible, yet it pulled at his coat, dragging him down. He looked around the laboratory one last time. The shadows had lengthened, creeping up the walls to swallow the rows of bottles and jars. The chemicals sat in their glass prisons, silent and unhelpful. They offered no verdicts, no justice, only reactions, only possibilities. He nodded to the chemist, a curt dip of the chin that acknowledged the futility of the exchange. Pepperell did not look up, already scrubbing at the bench with a brush, trying to remove Thes Egrav one of the experiment. The sound of bristles on wood filled the room, a scratching noise that sounded like a pen writing a letter that would never be sent. Neil stepped out into the corridor. The air here was cooler, stripped of the chemical bite, but heavy with the damp chill of the London evening. He walked towards the exit, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. Each step took him further from the certainty he had hoped to find, back towards the fog and the uncertainty of the streets. The envelope burned against his chest, a small, hot coal of hope that might extinguish before morning. Outside, the rain had started again, a fine mist that clung to the wool of his coat and darkened the pavement to black. A hansom waited near the curb, the horse shivering in the traces, steam rising from its flanks in ghostly plumes. Neil climbed in without a word, sinking into the damp leather seat. He pressed his hand against his pocket, feeling the hard edge of the wax seal through the fabric. The driver flicked the reins. The wheels groaned as they began to turn, splashing through a puddle that sent a spray of muddy water against the window. Neil watched the laboratory door recede in the glass, shrinking until it was just a rectangle of yellow light in the grey gloom, then gone. He closed his eyes. The image of the pink stain remained, vivid and taunting. It was not enough. He knew it with a cold, sinking clarity that settled in his gut. It was a suggestion, a whisper in a room full of shouting men. Wood would stand in the dock, charming and articulate, and he would smile that tight, unreadable smile. And the jury would look at the pink stain and the tiny speck on the cuff, and they would see not proof of murder, but the limitations of men trying to play God with test tubes and microscopes. The cab jolted over cobblestone, throwing Neil against the side. He opened his eyes. The city rushed past, a blur of gaslight and shadow, indifferent to the struggle unfolding in the mind of a tired inspector. The truth was there, hidden in the fibers of a shirt, but truth alone would not hang a man. Not in 1907, not without a story that made sense. And the story of Robert Wood and Emily Dimmock was a book with pages torn out, leaving only gaps where the motive should be. Neil touched the envelope again. The wax had cooled. The seal was hard, but the doubt inside him was fluid, spreading, filling the spaces where certainty used to be. He needed more. He needed something that could not be explained away by science or charm. He needed a voice from the grave or a slip of the tongue from the living. The cab turned onto Whitehall. The lights of the yard appeared ahead, a fortress of bureaucracy and frustration. Neil straightened his coat. He would write the report. He would state the findings, and he would prepare for the battle he knew was coming, armed with nothing but pink stains and the stubborn refusal to let a ghost walk free. The horse slowed. The journey was ending. The real work was just beginning. The horse snorted, a sharp burst of steam in the cold air, and the cab lurched to a halt against the curb. Neil paid the driver, coins clinking in the palm of a gloved hand, before swinging his legs out onto the pavement. Whitehall slept under a layer of soot. the gas lamps guttering low as dawn threatened to bleed into the sky. He climbed the steps of the building, his boots heavy on the stone, each impact echoing in the hollow vestibule. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and damp wool, a familiar scent that clung to the curtains and the carpet alike. A clerk sat behind a wooden screen, scratching a quill against paper, the sound like insects chewing through wood. He raised his head, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, and saw the inspector standing there. "Late, Mr. Neal." "Early," Neal corrected, stripping off his gloves. "I need the magistrate now." Gardner's inside, waiting for the ink to dry on the previous docket. The clerk gestured with his chin towards the oak door at the end of the hall. He said not to be disturbed unless the city was burning. "This is close enough." Neal pushed the door open without knocking. Mr. Gardner sat at a desk cluttered with files, a half-eaten sandwich resting on a plate near his elbow. The magistrate looked up, chewing slowly, and swallowed before speaking. "You look like hell, Inspector." "I need a warrant." Neal placed the envelope from the laboratory on the desk. It slid across the polished wood, stopping just short of the magistrate's hand. "For Robert Wood, willful murder." Gardner picked up the envelope, turning it over in his fingers. The wax seal cracked under his thumb. He withdrew the report, scanned the page, and then set it down again. The paper lay flat, innocent and white against the dark wood. "Pepperell's findings. Inconclusive." "Then on what grounds?" Gardner leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "You know the law. I cannot sign a death warrant on pink stains and intuition." "I have the handwriting, Ruby Young's testimony." Neal kept his voice level, though the doubt from the cab ride still coiled in his gut. "And I have the timeline. He was there. We both know he was there." Knowing and proving are different beasts. As Gardner reached for a pen to dip the nib into an inkwell, the black liquid gleamed, thick and viscous. "If I sign this, there is no turning back, for the press will have blood in the water." "Let them feed." Gardner hesitated, the pen hovering above the document. For a second, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the mantel, a steady rhythm counting down seconds that belonged to a man who might still be sleeping. Then the nib touched the paper, scratch, scratch. The signature flowed across the bottom of the page, bold and final. "Take it," Gardner said, blowing on the wet ink, "but God help you if he walks." Neal took the warrant. The paper was cool, damp with the fresh ink. He folded it once, twice, and slid it into his inner pocket. The weight of it pulled at his coat, heavier than the envelope had been. "Constables are waiting outside," Neal said. "I need 4 men, armed." "You expect resistance?" "I expect a scene." Neal turned and left the office, the door clicking shut behind him. In the corridor, 4 constables stood in a line, their helmets tucked under their arms, faces pale in the gaslight. They straightened as he approached, hands moving to the buttons of their tunics. "Sergeant Miller." "Sir." Miller stepped forward, a tall man with a moustache that bristled when he spoke. "We move now, St. Paul's Road, number 29. Neal kept his voice low, though the words carried down the hall. "We are arresting Robert Wood for the murder of Emily Dimmock. No shouting, no unnecessary force, but if he runs, you bring him down." "Understood, sir." "Form up." They moved out into the street, the group merging with the shadows of the building before stepping onto the pavement. The sky above was a bruised purple, the color of a healing wound stretching over the rooftops of London. Fog clung to the ground, swirling around their boots as they marched. The city was waking up. A cart rumbled past, wheels iron-shod and loud. The driver slumped over the reins. Neal led the way, his hand resting on the pocket where the warrant lay. Every step was a declaration. The cobbles were slick with mist, requiring care, but the men kept the pace. They turned onto the road that led to Camden, the buildings changing from the grand stone of Whitehall to the brick and mortar of the working districts. Chimneys puffing grey smoke into the air marked the homes of those who rose with the sun. Here the silence was different. It was not the silence of sleep, but of withholding. Curtains twitched as they passed. Faces appeared in windows, vanished quickly. Miller walked beside Neal, his breath pluming in the cold. "Quiet today, sir." "They know," Neal said. Word travels faster than the constabulary. Think he's in. He's in. Neil watched the road ahead. The gas lamps were being extinguished, one by one, as the natural light grew stronger. He paints in the mornings, always has. Artists, Miller muttered. Strange lot. Today he is just a suspect. They reached the turning for St. Paul's Road. The houses stood in a row, identical fronts of red brick, dirty and stained by the years. Number 29 sat in the middle, the door painted black, the brass knob dull. No light showed in the windows. The curtains were drawn tight against the morning. Neil stopped at the gate. The iron was cold under his palm. He looked at the door, remembering the description of the lock, the bolt, the way it had been found. Now they would break it open again, this time with the law behind them. Miller, take 2 men to the back. Ensure no exit is left open. So. The sergeant peeled away, leading the others around the side of the house. Neil remained with the remaining constable, standing before the black door. He could hear the sound of a bird singing somewhere above, a thin, clear note that seemed out of place in the heavy air. He adjusted his collar, feeling the stiff fabric against his neck. Knock, Neil said. The constable raised his fist and struck the wood, 3 heavy blows that echoed into the hallway beyond. They waited as the sound of the bird stopped, leaving nothing else to move. No footsteps approached, nor did any voice ask who was there. Neil watched the brass knob. It did not turn. Again. The constable struck harder. The wood groaned under the impact. Still, the silence held, thick and impenetrable, waiting for someone on the other side to decide whether to open or to hide. Neil placed his hand on the door frame, feeling the vibration of the next knock before it landed, and prepared for whatever lay behind the paint. The latch clicked. The black door swung inward, revealing the hallway beyond, dim and smelling of turpentine and stale tobacco. Robert Wood stood there, not in a dressing gown as a man might expect when roused from sleep, but dressed in a dark suit, the collar stiff, the tie knotted with precision. He held a pipe in one hand, the bowl cold, and looked at Neil without surprise. There was no flinch, no attempt to close the gap between them. Inspector, Wood said. His voice was low, smooth, carrying the cadence of a man accustomed to being heard in crowded rooms. Neil produced the warrant. The paper rustled, loud in the narrow space. Robert Wood, you are charged with the willful murder of Emily Dimmock. I must ask you to come with us. Wood glanced at the document, then at the constable behind Neil, before nodding once. He placed the pipe on the hall table, aligning it parallel to the edge. May I bring a coat? It is damp outside. Make it quick. Wood turned and walked towards the stairs. He did not run. He did not look for an escape. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man retrieving an item from a shelf. Neil waited, his hand resting on the revolver beneath his jacket, though the tension in his shoulders had little to do with fear of violence. It was the weight of the spectacle waiting beyond the threshold. He could hear it now, a low murmur rising from the street, the scuff of boots on pavement, the click of a camera shutter tested in the gloom. Word had leaked. It always did. The telegraph wires hummed faster than the constabulary could march. Wood returned with a heavy overcoat draped over his arm. He allowed Miller to snap the handcuffs onto his wrists, the steel biting into the skin with a click that sounded final. There was no resistance, no plea. Wood simply adjusted the coat over the cuffs, hiding the metal from view, as if the arrest were a minor social embarrassment rather than a charge of hanging. Ready, Wood said. Neil pushed the door open. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the row of brick houses, but the space before number 29 was clear, illuminated by the sudden, violent flare of magnesium powder. A white burst seared the air, leaving purple spots dancing in Neil's vision. The smell hit him instantly, acrid and sulphurous, burning the back of the nose like a struck match. Over here, Mr. Wood. Look this way. Did you do it, Wood? Did you cut her throat? The shout came from a man near the front, a notebook clutched in a gloved hand. Others surged forward, elbows digging into ribs, hats knocked askew in the scramble for position. They were not merely reporters, they were scavengers drawn by the scent of blood in the water, eager to feed on the ruin of a man who had painted nudes and walked with women in the public eye. Neil stepped in front of Wood, raising a hand to shield the prisoner's face, though he knew it was futile. The lenses were already capturing the image that would print in every broadsheet from London to Edinburgh. "Back," Neil roared. "Make way for the crown." "Is it true she was naked, Inspector?" a woman shouted from the edge of the crowd. Her voice was sharp, hungry. "Is it true he left her on the bed like a display?" Neil ignored her. He grabbed Wood by the elbow, steering him through the gap in the press. The bodies pressed in, warm and solid, smelling of wet wool and cheap perfume. A camera box bumped against Neil's thigh. Someone tried to slip past Miller, only to be shoved back with a grunt. The fog muffled the sounds, turning the shouts into a distant roar, but the flashes continued, intermittent lightning strikes in the grey morning. Wood walked steadily. He did not shrink from the questions. He did not answer them. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, past the rooftops, past the chimneys, looking at something none of them could see. He might have been posing for a portrait, holding still while the artist sketched his profile, rather than being led to a cell where the walls were painted a sickly green and the air smelled of lime and despair. "Get the cab," Neil ordered Miller. The sergeant had secured a hansom near the corner, the horse stamping impatiently, steam rising from its flanks. Neil pushed Wood towards the vehicle, shielding him from a man who thrust a pencil towards the prisoner's face. "Any statement, Wood, for the public?" Wood paused at the step of the cab. He turned his head just slightly and looked at the reporter. For a second, the detachment slipped. A flicker of amusement touched the corner of his mouth, gone before Neil could be sure it had been there. "No comment," Wood said. He climbed into the cab. Neil followed, slamming the door against the press. The interior was cramped, smelling of old leather and rain. Through the glass window, the faces were still visible, pale discs in the fog, pressing closer as the driver whipped the reins. The wheels groaned, biting into the cobbles, and the carriage lurched forward. Neil sat opposite Wood. The handcuffs glinted in the dim light filtering through the rain-streaked glass. Outside, the shouts faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of hooves. The city rolled by, indifferent. A milk cart passed. A woman swept a step. Life continued while a man sat bound in the back of a cab, accused of slaughter. Wood looked at his hands, folded in his lap. He rubbed his thumb over the knuckle of his index finger, a slow, repetitive motion. He did not look at Neil. He did not speak. The silence in the cab was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of the evidence, the blood-stained shirt, the handwriting on the postcard, the locked door. Neil watched him. He looked for a tremor in the hand, a twitch in the eye, any sign of the guilt that should accompany a man taken for such a crime. There was nothing, only the calm of a man who believed he had already won, or one who felt nothing at all. "Comfortable?" Neil asked, the words in the quiet. Wood lifted his head. His eyes were clear, devoid of the fear that usually clouded the faces of men in his position. "It is a journey, Inspector. One must endure it." He turned back to the window. The fog pressed against the glass, obscuring the street, turning the world outside into a smear of grey and black. Neil leaned back, the leather creaking under his weight. He touched the pocket where the warrant lay, the paper now softening with the dampness of the day. They were moving towards the station, towards the cells, towards the trial that would tear this moment apart and examine it under the harsh light of the Old Bailey. But here, in the dark of the cab, with the handcuffs clicking softly as Wood shifted his wrists, the truth remained locked away. Neil could not tell if he was transporting a killer or a victim of circumstance. The ambiguity sat between them, solid as a third passenger, breathing the same stale air. The cab turned a corner, the wheels slipping on the wet stone. Wood did not sway. He remained upright, rigid, watching the fog swallow the road ahead, leaving Neil to wonder if the silence was a shield or a confession. The Old Bailey smelled of polished oak and stale breath, a sharp departure from the wet wool and horse steam of the cab. Neil stood in the witness box, his fingers tracing the grain of the railing where 1,000 thumbs had rubbed the wood smooth. Above, the gas jets hissed, casting a yellow haze over the jury box where 12 men sat rigid in their collars. They looked like jurors everywhere, bored, hungry, eager to be done with the business of death before the lunch hour struck. Mr. Abinger rose to address them. He did not shout. His voice was a smooth baritone that rolled through the courtroom without effort, settling into the corners where the shadows clung thickest. He spoke of the locked door at St. Paul's Road as though it were a riddle posed by a child, simple on the surface, but impossible to solve without the key. No witness placed the defendant inside that room, Abinger said, turning slowly to face the dock. Not one soul saw Mr. Wood cross the threshold before the blood was spilled. Wood sat behind the rail, hands clasped on the ledge. He wore a dark suit that fit too well for a man accused of butchery, his posture relaxed, almost languid. He caught Neil's eye for a fraction of a second, then looked away, focusing on the judge's wig as if it were a piece of art worthy of study. The insolence of it tightened Neil's chest. Abinger called the graphologist. The man was slight, bespectacled, carrying a leather case that he opened with reverent care. He laid 2 sheets of paper on the desk, one a postcard sent to Emily Dimmock, signed Will West, the other a sample of Wood's known correspondence. The ink on the postcard was dry, black, unforgiving. "Observe the flourish on the W," the expert said, adjusting his lenses. He pointed with a slender rod, tapping the paper. "It loops upward, distinct and sharp." "And is this unique?" Abinger asked. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, embodying the casual confidence of a man who knows the ground beneath him is solid. "By no means." The graphologist shuffled the papers, the sound crisp in the quiet room. "I have seen this same formation in a dozen hands within the last month alone. It is a common affectation among those who write with speed." Neil felt the floor tilt. In the gallery, Ruby Young sat stiffly, her gloved hands clenched in her lap. She had sworn on the Bible that the handwriting was Wood's, had staked her reputation on the curve of a letter. Now, under the glare of the court lights, her certainty was being dismantled by a man with a magnifying glass and a calm voice. "So you are saying," Abinger pressed, "that Miss Young's identification is merely a guess?" "I am saying it is an opinion, not a fact." The distinction hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Neil shifted his weight, the sole of his boot squeaking against the floorboards. He wanted to intervene, to shout that the resemblance was undeniable, that the context mattered more than the loop of a letter. But the rules of the court bound his tongue. He could only watch as the prosecution's timeline frayed at the edges. Wood shifted in the dock. He cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound. "It is a matter of style, is it not?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly despite the lack of invitation. "One writes as one paints." The judge rapped his gavel. Silence in the dock. Wood smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but Neil saw it. It was the smile of a man who knows the net is full of holes. Abinger turned back to the jury, spreading his hands. "We are asked to condemn a man based on the curve of a pen stroke. We are asked to ignore the locked door, the lack of witnesses, the ambiguity of the evidence." He paused, letting the words settle. "Reasonable doubt is not a high bar, gentlemen. It is simply the requirement that you be sure. Are you sure?" The foreman of the jury looked down at his hands. Another man scratched his chin, the stubble rasping against his palm. They were thinking of their own homes, their own dinners, the inconvenience of hanging a man on a guess. Neil gripped the railing tighter. The wood felt cold now, sapping the warmth from his palms. He thought of Emily Dimmock lying on the bed, the sheets soaked through, the life drained out of her onto the floorboards. He thought of the blood-stained shirt waiting in the evidence locker, the red ochre stains that the defense would soon claim were paint. The case was slipping away, not with a crash, but with the quiet erosion of certainty. The graphologist packed away his lenses, clicking the leather case shut. The sound was final, like a lock engaging. Ruby Young stared at the back of the man's head, her face pale, her lips moving in a silent argument that no one could hear. She had done her part. She had told the truth as she saw it. But the truth, it seemed, was malleable in the hands of a skilled barrister. "Thank you," Abinger said. He returned to his seat, smoothing the front of his coat. He did not look triumphant. He looked merely satisfied, like a craftsman who has completed a difficult joinery task. Neil exhaled, a long, slow breath that did nothing to relieve the pressure in his lungs. The court usher moved to the next exhibit, a bundle of clothing wrapped in brown paper. The shirt, the next battleground. Neil watched the jury lean forward, their attention shifting from the abstract theory of handwriting to the physical reality of the stain. He caught Wood's eye again. The artist was watching the bundle being unwrapped, his expression unreadable. There was no fear there, only a cold, calculating interest, as if he were observing a still life arranged for his own amusement. "Exhibit C," the clerk announced. The shirt was held up by the usher, the fabric stiff with age and whatever substance had dried into the weave. The light caught the discoloration on the sleeve, a dark rust against the white cotton. Neil waited for the gasp, the murmur of recognition. Instead, there was only the shuffle of feet and the cough of a man in the back row. Abinger stood again. He walked towards the shirt, circling it like a shark inspecting prey. "Red ochre," he said softly, though the microphone carried the words to every corner. "Or blood." He turned to the jury, his face grave. "Science cannot tell us which, not yet, so we must decide based on what we know, not what we hope." Neil closed his eyes for a second. The hope was gone. All that remained was the struggle to make them see the blood for what it was, even if the chemicals remained silent. He opened his eyes and fixed his gaze on the foreman. He needed one of them to believe, just one. But the doubt was already in the room, sitting among them like an extra juror, whispering in their ears that a mistake here would cost a man his life. And in 1907, a mistake was easier to live with than a hanging. The usher lowered the shirt, the fabric folding in on itself to hide the stain from view. Neil felt the hook set deep in his gut. The defense had opened the door, and now they would walk through it. The bench dug into the back of Neil's thighs, hard oak unyielding against the wool of his trousers. Hours had bled away since the shirt was lowered, the closing arguments stretching the afternoon into a grey, indistinct smear, where the barristers' voices merged into a single drone of persuasion and counterclaim. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light cutting through the high window, settling on the shoulders of the jury like snow on gravestones. Neil shifted his weight, the leather of his notebook creaking under his grip, ink drying on the nib of his pen before he could find a reason to write. What remained to be recorded? The law had become a matter of semantics, a debate on the curvature of letters and the chemical composition of rust, while the memory of a throat cut in a Camden lodging room faded behind the varnish of procedure. The judge began his summation. His voice was dry, precise, stripping the emotion from the blood until only the legal framework remained standing. He spoke of burden of proof, of the heavy responsibility resting on 12 men who knew nothing of the streets where the gaslight flickered against the damp pavement. Neil listened without hearing, his eyes fixed on the dock. Wood sat perfectly still, hands resting on the rail, fingers tapping a silent rhythm against the wood. There was no tension in the artist's shoulders, no tightening of the jaw that might betray a man facing the gallows. He watched the judge as a critic watches a mediocre play, waiting for the final act to conclude so he might leave for dinner. When the jury filed out, the clock on the wall ticked with a violence that echoed in the hollow of Neil's chest. 40 minutes. An hour. The gallery whispered, rustling papers and shifting feet, the sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Neil opened his notebook again, staring at the blank page where the verdict should go. He pressed the pen down, leaving a single ink blot that spread slowly, consuming the white space. Outside, the winter light was failing, the shadows lengthening across the floorboards of the court, creeping towards the dock like a tide. He closed the book. There was nothing left to document. The usher called them back. 12 men marched in, faces flushed from the heat of the deliberation room, avoiding the eyes of the accused. The foreman stood, a hat clutched in both hands, knuckles white against the felt. He looked at the judge, then at the floor, then at the wall behind the bench. "Do you find the prisoner guilty or not guilty?" The clerk's voice cut through the humidity. "Not guilty." The words dropped flat, lacking weight, as if the foreman wished them to vanish before they hit the air. A noise erupted from the gallery, a sudden intake of breath followed by a rush of exhalation that sounded like a wave breaking against a pier. Someone cheered, quickly stifled by the bailiff's sharp hiss. Wood did not move. He accepted the words with a slight nod, acknowledging a transaction completed, and turned to his counsel. Abinger leaned in, speaking low, a hand resting on Wood's arm for a brief second before withdrawing. Neil watched the exchange, the intimacy of it striking him harder than the verdict itself. They were already planning the next step, the press statement, the escape from the building, while the body of the woman lay cold in the mortuary slab. The judge discharged the prisoner. His gavel fell, a single sharp crack that sealed the fate of the investigation. Prisoner discharged. Wood stepped down from the dock. He moved with a loose-limbed grace, unaffected by the stairs boring into his back. He adjusted his cuff, smoothing the fabric over his wrist, and walked towards the exit without glancing at the prosecution table. Neil remained seated, the bench holding him in place as if he were part of the fixture. He watched the artist pass, close enough to touch, close enough to smell the faint scent of tobacco and turpentine that clung to his coat. Wood's eyes met his for a fraction of a second. There was no triumph there, no mockery, just a blank, polished surface that reflected nothing back. "Inspector." Gardner stood beside him, holding his own briefcase, face drawn tight. "We did what we could, Neil. The evidence, it wasn't enough for them." "It was enough for me." Neil's voice sounded rough, unused. He looked down at the notebook on his knee. The leather cover was worn at the corners, stained with the grease of 100 meals taken at a desk. He ran his thumb over the edge, feeling the ridge where the pages began. "The press will have a field day." Gardner shifted his weight, looking towards the door where the crowd was already surging forward, eager to taste the scandal. "They'll say the Yard bungled it, say we pinned it on the wrong man to close the file." "Let them say it." Neil stood up, his joints stiff from the long sit. The blood rushed back into his legs, a prickling heat that made him stumble slightly before he regained his balance. He tucked the notebook under his arm, pressing it against his ribs. The weight of it was negligible, yet it felt like carrying a stone. Wood was gone, swallowed by the throng of reporters and curious onlookers flooding the aisle. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of questions and shouts that bounced off the high ceiling. Neil ignored it. He stepped around the bench, navigating the narrow gap between the railing and the wall, his boots clicking on the stone floor. The air in the court was stale now, thick with the breath of too many people, the scent of wool damp with sweat, and the acrid tang of nervous perspiration. He reached the door but paused, hand resting on the handle. The brass was cold, leaching the warmth from his palm. Behind him, the clerk was stacking papers, the rustle of documents signaling the end of the day's work. The court would be empty soon, swept clean for the next tragedy, the next accusation, the next performance of justice. Neil turned back to the room one last time. The dock stood empty, the wood gleaming under the gas lamps, waiting for the next prisoner to stand where Wood had stood. "Inspector," Gardner called from the corridor, his voice muffled by the din. Neil pushed the handle down. The latch clicked, a small mechanical sound lost in the uproar. He stepped into the hallway, the noise of the court fading behind him as he moved towards the stairs. The building smelled of limestone and old paper, a scent that clung to the back of the throat. He needed air. He needed to see the sky, even if it was choked with London fog. The notebook under his arm felt heavier with every step, a permanent record of a failure that could not be erased by closing the cover. At the top of the stairs, he stopped. The crowd below was parting, making way for the man who had walked free. Wood was descending, surrounded by friends, laughing at something Abinger had said. The sound floated up, clear and sharp. Neil gripped the banister, the wood rough under his fingers. He watched them go, knowing this was not the end. The file would be closed, but the question would remain, hanging in the air like smoke. He opened the notebook again. On the fresh page, he wrote the date. December 20th, 1907. Below it, he wrote one word, acquitted. He capped the pen, the click sounding like a lock engaging. The job was done. The city waited. Heavy oak doors of the Old Bailey groaned open, admitting a slice of the afternoon that looked washed out and thin. Fog had retreated to the river, leaving a sky the color of bruised linen, pale and offering no warmth to the stone steps below. Wood emerged first, shielding his eyes with a gloved hand as if the weak light offended him. A roar went up from the pavement, a jagged sound of relief and hunger mixed together, where reporters jostled for position like men fighting for scraps at a dockside spill. Flashbulbs popped, magnesium flaring white against the grey stone, catching the sharp line of Wood's jaw before he dropped his hand. He did not smile. Abinger ushered him forward, a protective barrier of black wool and legal authority, batting away microphones and shouted questions with a dismissive wave that never broke his stride. No comment, the judge has spoken. Abinger's voice cut through the din, smooth and practiced, while Wood simply walked, his boots clicking a steady rhythm on the wet granite. He moved with an economy of motion, conserving energy, as though he had been holding his breath for 6 weeks and only now remembered how to exhale. A friend clapped him on the shoulder, a familiar gesture of camaraderie that Wood accepted with a slight dip of his chin, never breaking his gaze from the line of hansom cabs waiting by the curb. Neil stood in the shadow of the doorway, the collar of his coat turned up against the damp chill that seeped through the fabric. He kept his hands in his pockets, fingers curled around the cold metal of his notebook, feeling the ridges of the pages pressing against his palm. The crowd surged, a living thing that pushed and heaved, separating the acquitted from the accusers without a second thought. Someone elbowed Neil in the ribs, a sharp jab of bone against bone, muttering an apology that was lost before it was fully formed. He did not move. He watched the artist navigate the throng, noting the way Wood's shoulders remained relaxed, the absence of any tremor in the hand that adjusted his scarf. "Over here, Mr. Wood, did you fear the gallows? Look this way for the sketch." Wood ignored them all. He reached the first cab, the driver already leaning down to open the door, his face eager for a tip or a glimpse of fame. Wood stepped up, placing one foot on the rung, then paused. For a heartbeat, the noise of the street seemed to drop away, the shouting and the carriage wheels and the distant rumble of the omnibuses fading into a dull hum. He turned his head, scanning the faces pressing against the railings, the sea of hats and upturned collars searching for a familiar shape. His eyes swept over the reporters, the curious clerks, the women clutching their baskets, and for a fraction of a second, they locked onto Neil. There was no challenge in the look, no triumph, just a flat, unreadable acknowledgement, as if he were noting the presence of a lamppost or a pile of refuse on the corner. Then he climbed inside, the dark interior swallowing him whole. The door slammed shut with a solid thud that echoed louder than the shouts. The driver cracked his whip, the leather snapping in the air, and the horse lunged forward, hooves striking sparks from the cobbles. The cab pulled away, weaving through the traffic, the wheels splashing through a puddle of murky water that coated the tires in sludge. Neil watched it go, tracking the movement until the vehicle was swallowed by the gloom of Fleet Street, disappearing into the artery of the city that would digest this story and spit it out as tomorrow's headlines. The red tail light of the cab blinked once, twice, then vanished around a bend. "Got away clean, didn't he?" Gardner appeared at his elbow, lighting a cigarette with cupped hands that shielded the flame from the wind. The smoke curled up, grey against the grey sky, carrying the scent of cheap tobacco that masked nothing. "They'll print his picture on every front page by morning. The artist acquitted, justice prevails." He took a long drag, the ember glowing bright orange before fading. "They won't mention the blood on the shirt, or the postcards, just the verdict. The verdict is what matters to them." Neil's voice was low, barely audible over the clatter of a passing dray cart loaded with crates of fruit. He stepped off the threshold, his boots sinking slightly into the grit that accumulated on the steps. The air tasted of coal smoke and horse manure, the familiar perfume of London that clung to the back of the throat and settled in the lungs. To us, it is just a piece of paper. A piece of paper that lets him walk. Gardner flicked the ash onto the pavement, watching it scatter in the wind. "What now, Inspector? Do we keep watching him, follow him to his studio?" Neil looked down the street, where the traffic had already closed the gap left by the cab. The flow of the city resumed, indifferent to the drama that had just played out on its steps. Carriages rattled past, their passengers hidden behind glass, eager to get home to warm fires and evening meals. "We do nothing," he said, the words tasting bitter. "The Crown has finished with him. To pursue him further without new evidence would be harassment, and we have no new evidence." "Doesn't mean he didn't do it." "No." Neil turned away from the street, facing the great stone face of the court. The building loomed above them, imposing and silent, its windows reflecting the dull light of the afternoon. "It doesn't mean anything at all. That is the trouble." He began to walk down the steps, moving slowly, each step deliberate. The stone was cold under his feet, leaching the warmth from his soles. At the bottom, he paused, looking back up at the empty doorway where Wood had emerged. The crowd had dispersed, drifting away to find other amusements, other scandals to feed upon. Only a few stragglers remained, picking through the litter of discarded programs and cigarette ends. A newspaper boy shouted the headline, his voice cracking with the effort, trying to sell a story that was already old news. Extra, extra, would set free, all about the Camden murder. Neil ignored the boy. He pulled his notebook from his pocket, the leather stiff in the cold air. He opened it to the page where he had written acquitted, the ink still wet, glistening black in the fading light. He ran a finger over the word, smudging it slightly, blurring the edges until it looked like a stain. Then he closed the book, the snap of the cover sounding final, like a coffin lid lowering into place. "Come on, Gardner," he said, tucking the notebook under his arm. "Let's get back to the yard. There are other files waiting." "And the Dimmock woman?" Gardner asked, falling into step beside him as they moved towards the waiting carriage. "What happens to her file?" Neil stopped, his hand resting on the door handle of the hansom. He looked at Gardner, his eyes tired, the lines around them deepened by the strain of the last 3 months. "She stays in the box," he said quietly, "with the rest of them, the ones we couldn't save, the ones the law couldn't touch." He climbed inside, the leather seat cold and cracked. Gardner followed, slamming the door shut against the noise of the street. The driver whipped the horse, and they lurched forward, joining the stream of vehicles flowing away from the court. Neil leaned back, closing his eyes as the carriage swayed. The rhythm of the wheels on the cobbles was hypnotic, a steady beat that matched the pounding in his head. He thought of the room at St. Paul's Road, the blood on the floorboards, the silence that had greeted them when they first broke down the door. That silence was still there, he knew. It had not been broken by the trial or the verdict or the shouting of the crowd. It waited, patient and heavy, in the dark of the lodging house, waiting for someone to listen. The carriage turned a corner, the wheels grinding against the stone, and Neil opened his eyes. The city rushed past, a blur of brick and gaslight, indifferent to the justice done within its walls. He touched the notebook again, feeling the weight of it against his side. It was done. The file would be closed, but the question remained, hanging in the air like the smoke from Gardner's cigarette, refusing to dissipate. Who had locked the door? The thought surfaced, unbidden, sharp and clear. He pushed it down, burying it beneath the routine of the return journey, the promise of tea and warmth at the office. But it stayed there, a splinter in the mind, poking at the edges of his certainty. The cab rattled on, carrying him away from the court, away from Wood, but not away from the silence. It followed him, a shadow in the corner of his eye, a whisper in the roar of the wheels. The city waited, and Neil knew, with a sinking certainty that settled in his gut like lead, that the silence would never truly break. The cab shuddered to a halt outside the grey brick face of New Scotland Yard, the horse blowing steam into the chill air that smelled of wet wool and exhausted coal. Neil stepped down, his boots finding the familiar grit of the pavement, and paid the driver with coins that felt heavy and cold in his numb fingers. Gardner said nothing, merely adjusting his collar against the wind that swept up from the river, carrying the scent of salt and sewage that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove from London's skin. They climbed the steps, the heavy oak doors swinging open to admit them into the warmth of the corridor, where the gas jets hissed softly, casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling paint of the walls. The building breathed around them, a living thing of dust and paper, holding the secrets of 1,000 crimes within its fireproof safes and wooden cabinets. Neil walked past the duty desk, ignoring the nod of the sergeant on watch, his eyes fixed on the corridor that led to his office, a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He wanted tea. He wanted the fire to be low and the door to be shut. He wanted to forget the sound of the foreman's voice, dry and devoid of conviction, speaking words that freed a man while condemning a memory to limbo. But the file waited. It sat on his desk, a thick bundle of testimony and exhibits tied with red tape that had faded to pink in the light of the window. He entered the room, the smell of stale tobacco and ink greeting him like an old, unwelcome friend, and closed the door against the murmur of the outer office. Gardner lingered by the threshold, hands in his pockets, watching as Neil moved to the desk and placed the notebook down with a precision that suggested violence held in check. "Shall I bring the pot, Inspector?" Gardner asked, his voice low, careful not to disturb the heavy air that had settled in the room since they crossed the threshold. Neil did not answer immediately. He stood over the file, his hands resting on the cover, feeling the texture of the paper beneath his palms, rough and unyielding. "Yes," he said finally, the word clipped. "And then leave me." Gardner hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face, perhaps pity or perhaps just the weariness of a man who has seen too many doors close without resolution. He nodded once, a sharp dip of the chin, and slipped out into the corridor, pulling the door shut until the latch clicked, sealing Neil in with the silence. Alone, Neil sank into the chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and drew the file towards him. He untied the tape, the knot stiff from disuse, his fingers working slowly until the loops gave way and the covers fell open. Inside lay the life of Emily Dimmock, reduced to statements, sketches, and photographs that captured her stillness in a way life never could. There was the drawing of the room, the bed, the washstand, the position of the body marked in pencil with a clinical detachment that made his stomach turn. There were the postcards, the handwriting analyzed and debated until the ink seemed to blur before his eyes, the loops and tails of the letters dissected by experts who could agree on nothing but their own uncertainty. He picked up the sheet where Ruby Young's testimony was recorded, her words transcribed by a clerk who had missed the tremor in her voice, the fear that had made her hesitate before identifying the hand that wrote Will West. "I am sure of it," she had said, or words to that effect, but certainty in a witness box was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the hammer of a clever defense. Wood had sat there, calm, articulate, wearing his innocence like a well-tailored suit, and the jury had believed him because they wanted to, because the alternative was too dark to contemplate in the bright light of the courtroom. Neil traced the line of the signature on the charge sheet, the bold strokes of the clerk's pen that had initiated the process, now rendered meaningless by the verdict. He reached for the box on the floor beside his desk, a plain cardboard container labeled Unsolved 1907, and lifted the file. For a second, he held it suspended, the weight of it significant, a physical manifestation of failure, before lowering it into the box where it joined dozens of others, a stack of tragedies arranged by date and name. Dimmock, Emily, the label faced out, white against the dull brown of the cardboard, a stark reminder of the woman who would not speak again. He pushed the box under the desk, into the shadows where the dust motes danced in the beam of light from the window, and leaned back. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel, a steady, rhythmic sound that measured out seconds that no one could ever get back. He fumbled in his pocket for his cigarette case, the metal cool against his thumb, and extracted a cigarette, lighting it with a match that flared bright and brief in the dimming room. The smoke curled upwards, blue and thin, dissipating into the gloom, carrying with it the sharp tang of tobacco that did little to mask the underlying smell of the building, the scent of old paper and damp stone. He watched the smoke rise, his eyes unfocused, thinking of the locked door at number 29, the bolt that had been drawn from the inside, the mystery that had defied every logical explanation they had thrown at it. Who had locked it? The question hung in the air, unanswered, a ghost that refused to be exorcised by the verdict of a jury or the closing of a file. The law demanded proof, clear and undeniable, and they had not had it, not enough to satisfy 12 men who needed to be sure beyond a shadow of a doubt. But Neil knew, with a certainty that sat heavy in his gut, that shadows were where the truth often hid, lurking in the corners of rooms and the silences between words. He took a drag, the ember glowing orange, illuminating the lines of fatigue on his face, the grey that was creeping into his beard. Justice was a machine, he thought, grinding slowly, often crushing the innocent, but just as often letting the guilty slip through the gaps in its gears. It did not care about the blood on the floorboards or the tears of a friend. It cared only for procedure, for rules that could be written down and followed, even when they led to a result that felt wrong in the bones. The cigarette burned down to the filter, scorching his fingers, and he stubbed it out in the ashtray, the action abrupt, final. He stood up, walking to the window to look out at the yard below, where the gas lamps were being lit, one by one, casting pools of yellow light on the wet cobbles. The city was preparing for night, shutting up shop, drawing curtains, locking doors, seeking safety in the familiar routines of evening. Somewhere out there, Robert Wood was walking free, perhaps heading to a studio, perhaps to a pub, perhaps to a bed where he would sleep without the weight of chains on his wrists. And Emily Dimmock was in the ground, her story finished, her voice stilled, her name reduced to a headline and a case number. Neil turned away from the window, the glass reflecting his own image, a ghostly overlay on the darkness outside. He walked back to the desk and picked up the pen, dipping it into the inkwell, the nib scratching against the paper as he wrote the date and the word closed in the ledger. The ink flowed black and permanent, sealing the entry marking the end of the investigation. He blew on the page to dry the ink, the gesture automatic, and closed the ledger, the sound of the cover snapping shut echoing in the quiet room. It was done. The file was closed. The law was satisfied. But as he sat there in the dim light, listening to the clock tick away the seconds, Neil knew that the silence of the Agar Grove lodging house had not been broken. It remained, heavy and suffocating,